So, Stephen, a year ago, we were sat together on the stage of the Arabian Business Forum, and we asked the question, was the UAE the first post-COVID economy? And your answer then was, it already is. We've got figures now that show that this region is one of the most optimistic in the world. Do these findings in the CEO survey bear that out?
For once, Scott, and I don't get to say it very often, I was right, for once. And I think the region proved to be much more, if you like, digital, much more resilient, much more dynamic than maybe we gave ourselves credit for. And we saw, I guess, fueled by a few things in terms of the quality of the health response. So I think in terms of how we've responded, we've probably got a 6 to 9 month window ahead of the rest, many parts of the world, maybe 12 months in some areas. We've seen this super cycle of energy. We've seen the rise of renewables. We saw détente happening across the region as well with the Abraham Accords and the Al Ula Accords. So all of that fueled, if you like, and I think if one thing I was understated this time last year, I think I would have been even more confident, and the CEOs have kind of bared that out. Now, if you look forward, as the region, why we're getting even more confident, I like to say the region needs to do 4 or 5 things. We need to digitise, we need to decarbonise, we need to localise, we need to privatise, and we need to modernise. And if you look at, take the UAE, the acceleration of all of those things that's happened even in the last 2 or 3 months has been incredible. So you look at some of the announcements, new weekend, introducing corporate tax, you look at what they're doing on the raft of IPOs, and I think this is a sign that the UAE thinks actually we can compete on the global stage. And it's moving in that direction. It's a sign of confidence, and the CEOs are taking that confidence. And I think competing, the UAE did what I'd say the old world better than anyone else in terms of hard infrastructure. And I think this confidence now is about competing in what I'd say the new world, which is more on the softer infrastructure. So that might be on talent, on innovation, on the ability to create flexibility in the way people work, et cetera, et cetera. And the UAE have done a tremendous job in many of those things, so the confidence is there. And I think we're seeing some of that replicated across the region. So I'd even apply that to Saudi Arabia, where the progress towards Vision 2030, again, their health response was great. You're seeing that big sort of push towards Vision 2030 in other parts of the region.
We talk about the wider region, and the findings show a lot of CEOs looking to Saudi Arabia. We saw that a lot in 2021, and we're still seeing that in 2022, that Saudi Arabia is an avenue of opportunity, and also Egypt. So what are the fundamentals that are driving that kind of investment outlook? And also then what does that mean for the UAE and this part, for this country as well?
So I touched a little bit on Saudi. I mean, I think the Saudi story is a really compelling one from an investment perspective. We've seen the progress towards 2030, the investment that's going in, and the fundamentals of a population and the need to transform. The fundamental role it will play in energy transition, creating employment for the next generation, the transformation it's going through. So it's understandable that CEOs are excited about Saudi. I think from an Egypt perspective, I'm having way more conversations on investment opportunities, and people are feeling confident. That's a country with over 100 million people, and therefore the opportunities in FMCG, in banking, and actually it's a source of deep technology talent. So we're seeing a lot of my clients putting service centres there. Actually, service centres probably doing it a disservice. The talent is there to help with front office, etc. Now, actually, if you look at the UAE in that context, and I don't see, there's competition in the region, which is great, but this isn't a zero-sum game. So I think currently I see this as a win-win. I think what's good for the UAE is good for Saudi. What's good for Saudi is good for the UAE. What's good for Saudi is good for Egypt, certainly. And therefore there's a sort of rise, if you like, of opportunity. Maybe over time that competition might kick in, but I think for now, the opportunities are such that I think it's healthy competition, which is driving people to transform, driving people to improve.
And we've clearly seen the UAE up its game over the last 12 months with its narrative to the world, opening up foreign investment regulations, personal law regulations. So we had one author write a column to us, but basically used to say the UAE used to be the nicest house on a somewhat derelict street, and now the entire region is almost rising up. So is it a case of a rising tide lifting all boats?
Well, I think. Well, maybe to play on that analogy, I mean, if you have a very nice house in a very nice street with nice neighbours, then your house is worth more. Yeah. So I think I'd sort of play on that a little bit more. Eventually, there might be, we might be careful not to take this analogy too far, but there might be some keeping up with Joneses in the street, and that car looks quite nice, and that person's doing this or whatever. But
most of the cars here are quite nice.
They're quite nice anyway. It's hard to play that game, isn't it? If someone's got a Lamborghini down the road, then we're going to struggle. But I think that level of competition generally it's making the region look better to the outside world. It's attracting FDI. It's meaning people are going to have to put regulations in place to genuinely attract investment. It means there's a pressure on each of those countries to create local industries and to localise. I'm always a glass half full guy, but I think that level of competition generally helps.
To change gears a bit, one of the other findings in the CEO survey was this heavy emphasis on investing in leadership and talent retention. What is the gap that CEOs are looking to fill with this investment in the year ahead?
A really good point. I mean, I think I'd say there's two key aspects to this. Firstly, there's a volume game. Listen, we're growing. We need more leaders. I mean, that's a fairly basic answer to the question at the first level, but just in that growth spurt, and therefore, and I'm seeing it in my own organisation as we're growing, people in manager roles are now having to manage bigger teams, etc. So you need more leadership skills. So there's a volume game. I think the second point I'd make is on those capabilities. So to lead in this world is completely different, or is changing on a sort of daily basis. I know you've read quite a lot of what Blair talks about, but Blair talks about these 6 paradoxes of leadership, and I'm not going to talk about all 6, but maybe just pick out 2 or 3. So the first one I'd pick out was this concept of being a globally minded localist. So I've got to really understand the global context, those big trends that are happening, but actually in terms of leading, particularly in this region, I need to really understand the local context and be able to pull those 2 things together. The second paradox was being a tech-savvy humanist. So I've got to really understand AI, cloud. I mean, I don't have to write code myself, but I've got to understand how do I apply that. But also, at the end of the day, you're running a business that's run by people and you're selling product to people. So you've got to understand the human dimension of that, so putting those 2 together. And probably the other one I'd pick out, and actually it was picked out in the round table we just had around this idea of being a humble hero. Yeah. And this is probably not something that we associate in this region. Our leaders, I said from a business standpoint, we like to lead, we know everything, we're going to command the troops and they're going to follow and do what we say.
The superhuman.
The superhuman. And actually it's gone flip the other way. I need to be empathetic. I can't possibly know everything. There's too much to know in all those different dimensions. And therefore I've got to be humble enough to listen, to work out what I do know, what I don't know, and bring that ecosystem in. So going back to developing leaders, there's a volume play, but there's also, more importantly, how on earth do I create those new leaders with those skills? And that's not something that's just going to happen by osmosis. You need to think about how do I give people those global experiences? How do I get them into my MTech lab to develop the tech capabilities? How do I get them to think about empathy, etc.? So that whole leadership development, super important.
We've seen some of the incredible work that's happening in your R&D centre there, in talks of the metaverse and AI and VR. The CEO of today does need to climb down from that superhuman status, because it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to know all of that.
I think increasingly both within your own organisation and looking outside of your organisation. I think that's probably the other change in leadership, where you'd be very much a closed shop. I have all my capabilities here and I'm fighting against my competitor in that market, and not just in my industry, in all industries. Whereas now you're very much driving an ecosystem. So there'll be organisations that are sometimes competitors, sometimes you're collaborating with them, sometimes you are trying to force alliances with them. There's a complete 360 sometimes on the different organisations you work with. So if we want to get into metaverse or into AI, we'll do that, some of that ourselves. We'll work with alliance partners. We'll look at startups. We'll invest in some ventures. And we're the same as other organisations, having to create that ecosystem that you can operate in.
a lot of CEOs worry about their ability to innovate in the next 12 months. And that talks about what we've just been talking about. Yep. And yet we know, the innovation is going to be driven by Gen Zs and millennials. But then we look at the findings in the CEO survey that say that CEOs are still not embracing areas which are incredibly important to those generations, which is gender, diversity, inclusion, E, S, and G. Doesn't the CEO need to wake up and recognize that you can't tackle the innovation question unless you tackle, you innovate in your own workforces and your own cultures? Maybe
I'll go two directions with this. Maybe I think on ESG itself, and I think both innovation and also in the findings, there was a fairly, 5% of CEOs had said to net zero, et cetera, et cetera. I have a slightly different view on ESG, particularly in our region. I think it's much more fundamental potentially than other regions of the world. It's fundamental everywhere, but there's a kind of, I think ESG can act as a catalyst for the transformation that we're going through. And actually ESG allows us to sort of reimagine a kind of different GCC. Just bear with me for a second on that. What do I mean by that? So if you take the E, S, and G and then think about it in our context. So environment. So if you think about our region, we are globally strategically important in energy transition. This is the one part of the world, or one of the parts of the world, that's so important in how that transition is going to happen, both in terms of what happens to existing assets, but also the role we can play in a hydrogen economy, the role we can play in a circular economy, the roles we play in developing sustainable destinations, those areas on the E side of things. On the S side of things, one of the biggest challenges for our region is developing employment opportunities. So how are we going to get the next, literally tens of millions of people in our broader region into employment? And what does that mean about localising supply chains? What does it mean about thinking about the sort of social inclusion agenda? We've got the nationalisation agenda, bringing talent through, huge area for us. And then the G, governance, which is usually the bit that almost gets lost, almost forgotten about. But if we're going to attract FDI, if we're going through IPOs, moving government organisations into the private sector, next generations of families thinking about IPOing, how are we going to attract foreign direct investment into here, then that whole transformation in the way things are governed and that governance agenda becomes huge. So I think when looking at it as a business in the Middle East, and you think about those E, S, and G components, it moves way beyond I'm complying with a foreign standard so I can attract some investment. Actually, it's pretty fundamental both to the transformation of the region and also how I think about my business.
And then to go back to diversity and inclusion, one of the fundamentals, and I think you kind of touched upon it, is we've got an incredibly young population across the region. If we look at the UAE, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Egypt, so many young people who are going to be needing opportunities and wanting to grow into opportunities. So again, 29% on diversity and inclusion doesn't quite cut the mustard. So what do CEOs need to recognise about that?
Well, I think we're missing out on a huge amount of talent, and we're missing out on, frankly, it's a GDP opportunity in terms of making sure you have, just from a pure business perspective, forget it's the right thing to do in of itself, but just in terms of driving business. So I guess, maybe I'll give our own example. We're very focused on this area, and we've made a number of commitments that I think you have to start almost at the bottom of our pyramid, if you like, from a graduate perspective. So we committed this year, we will hire at least 500 graduates every year. We've done that already this year. We'll probably hit 600-700 by the end of the year. And we've committed to that being a 50-50 intake. And we've got there. It's not sometimes straightforward here, but we've set that target. It'll be 50-50. And that allows us to have a base where we can start to make an impact on that particular topic. I think you have to sort of set targets, hold people to account, put KPIs in place, and then also think about how do you create the environment, the culture, the purpose that means people want to spend time there and develop their careers.
I'm going to throw in one last curveball question for you. When we look at other parts of the world and the pace of how they're recovering and coming out of lockdowns and the economic opportunity, and then we look at what Saudi Arabia is doing, the UAE is doing, one commentator recently said that the next great renaissance was going to happen in this part of the world because they are future-facing and they're investing in innovation. What is your thought on that? Is this, you called it as the first post-COVID economy. In terms of renaissance in the world, what do you think on that one?
Well, I think I'd use the word leapfrog in a way, because I think we've been fortunate enough that the pandemic's had a terrible impact around the world. It's had a terrible impact here, and we shouldn't underestimate it. But I think the combination of the health response we've made, how people have followed those, and demographics and other has given us an advantage at that level. And yes, there's then a necessity to change, a real drive for that transformation agenda, and therefore, unencumbered to some degree by some of the legacy infrastructure, legacy history, etc. There is an opportunity to leapfrog. There's the ambition there. Frankly, in this we've got a sort of perfect storm in a way, in a positive way, in that we've got this super cycle in terms of where we are with oil price and the funding. So your combination of the funding being available, the necessity being there, and the ambition means they can do some pretty amazing things. And therefore, I think pivoting the economies towards renewables, towards some of the higher tech areas, there's lots of opportunity.
Stephen, thanks for your time.
Thank you, mate.